Hi, I'm Dan Bryan, and welcome to the first series of Real Impacts, the podcast where we explore how organisations communicate with creativity and impact. In this episode, we're joined by Paul Coates, Head of International Consultant and Delivery Excellence at FranklinCovey. With over 2 decades in learning and development leadership, Paul has built a career on transforming organisations by unlocking the potential of their people. From leading consultancy teams across Europe to shaping standards for FranklinCovey's international consultants, his expertise spans executive development, leadership coaching, cultural transformation, and organisational change. Paul's own journey into FranklinCovey is a fascinating one, first as a client and now as one of the organisation's most senior leaders. That experience gives him a unique perspective. He understands firsthand what it's like to be on the receiving end of FranklinCovey's principles and now has the privilege of enabling leaders worldwide to embed them in their organisations. In our conversation, Paul explores how learning and development has shifted from one-off training sessions to leader-led journeys that build resilience, trust, and lasting behaviour change. He shares FranklinCovey's 5 essentials for making learning stick: designing with intentionality, ensuring leadership alignment, creating a shared language, embedding reinforcement and accountability, and blending digital with live experiences. We also dive into the role of storytelling, why real, authentic stories are often the most powerful drivers for change, and how consistency is key when learning is scaled across teams, countries, and cultures. What comes through most clearly is Paul's belief that culture change only happens when leaders go first. As he puts it, people will do it when they see it being done. His passion for people development and his deep respect for FranklinCovey's content make this a conversation packed with both insight and practical takeaways for anyone seeking to build a stronger learning culture. Paul, welcome to the podcast episode. This is the first series of Real Impacts, and it's great that you're here with me today in your offices here at Banbury. So thank you for having us.
Thanks, Sam.
So today we're going to be talking about learning development, some shifts in learning development, and in the particular context of change and transformation. So before we get into it, could you just introduce to the audience yourself and your role here at FranklinCovey?
Absolutely. So I am Paul Coates. I'm Head of International Consultant and Delivery Excellence. So my role effectively is to make sure that all of our consultant services across the world are consistent, of high quality, and everyone's doing a really great job for our clients. Previously to that, I was Head of Consultancy for our European business. And previous to that, I was a client of FranklinCovey for about 10 years, which is where we met.
We did.
Indeed.
I think maybe it's about 15 years ago.
Probably, yeah.
Or so, a long time ago. So can you tell me a bit more about specifically what you do in your role, how FranklinCovey supports organisations through change?
Sure, absolutely. So my role breaks down into kind of a number of areas. So there's an element of it which is working with our clients directly. So typically I'm working with senior leadership teams, helping them build trust, become really resilient to change and transformation, which is just accelerating in the marketplace in the world today. So there's that part of my role. The other part of my role is I work with our marketing team here in Europe, and I design all of our marketing and thought leadership events, and I deliver the ones we run in London. But those events also, they go all over the country, delivered by other members of the team, and also increasingly are going international as well. And then there's the part of my job which actually does float my boat even more as well, which is policy. So understanding standards and policy and what is it that represents a really fantastic experience for a delivery into our clients. And we also, FranklinCovey, we really think our business divides into 3 places. It's content, people, and technology. And so I try to ensure that the people part represents our content really well and utilizes our technology in the best possible way.
Fantastic. Sounds like a really interesting, broad role.
It really is.
So can I just pick up on a point you mentioned? So you spoke about change and supporting organisations going through change, and that there's more change nowadays. How you support organisations and how organisations sort of manage change with their teams, has that changed over the years?
I think Broadly, change is pretty consistent. Organizations are always going to be facing and experiencing change. I think how we approach it has become, well, it's moved on from training to much more of what I would call a leadership dialogue. So we know we can train people to do better with change, to have a better experience with how they experience change. But what we increasingly believe is how change is led typically is going to be the thing that differentiates whether that change is successful or not. Leaders themselves have a direct impact on how successful change is. And so helping leaders to accelerate the pace of change while also making sure that their people have a good experience and that they reach the organizational goals has become much more of a focus area for us rather than simply just training. It's actually, let's start talking about a real change that an organization is going through. It may be, there's an organization I'm working with at the moment where they're going through really difficult change, where a lot of organizations are doing that now, where they're looking at, well, do we need the size of organization or in terms of people we have right now? There's another organization I'm working with where it's about moving a huge number of people to a new location 15,000 miles away. So it's really about moving on from kind of theoretical training to practical application. And that's where we're seeing change be most supported by us.
And through that support, how do you make sure that training? I know you don't necessarily like using that word, but
Spotted that.
training or interventions or messaging is more, I suppose, fluid and ongoing as opposed to just a one-off moment in time.
Yeah, so I think it's about understanding. Our typical approach is to understand what is the result the client is looking to get to, and based on that result, what's the right balance of intervention solution to help them achieve what they need. We always use a phrase that I like, which is called our kind of mission as an organization is to drive impact at scale, which is a nice strapline from a marketing point of view. But when I'm talking to clients, I always like them to, or like to ask the question, what level of scale do you need to have the impact you want? Because sometimes an organization, to get huge impact, you only need to work with the leadership team. And you can get massive impact. But other organizations, you need to work with thousands of people and get real collective behavior change. What we've found is if you want to move on from that single moment, what we would call an event in training, there's typically generally 5 key things that we would think about to say, how do we make something that's truly sustainable? So the first thing we would think about is, how do we design what we want to achieve with real intentionality? So that is, to my earlier point around, how do we really focus on the result that we're looking for the client to actually achieve? And have they understood exactly what they want to achieve? Now, sometimes that might be, we want everyone to have a lovely experience, but increasingly that's not the case. It's, what is the thing we're really going after to achieve, whether it's a huge change, whether it's we're refreshing our culture, whether it's a merger or an acquisition, what is the thing we're going after? So first of all, have we designed what we want to achieve intentionally? Is there a strong business case for it? Secondly, are leaders leading it? Any intervention, any solution has to be leader-led, but then we also need to have champions in the team. So actually, how do we create real advocates within the team? Thirdly, does everyone have a common framework and a language? And that's where I would say FranklinCovey is most known for, is 40 years of thought leadership, is creating frameworks and languages that people can share, whether it's, I'm trying to think, when we first met, it was 7 Habits, it was trust.
Seed of trust.
Presentation advantage as well, did we do as well?
I have no.
Oh, well, we'll talk about that one as well eventually. So, but it was all about, 15 years ago, you still remember the frameworks because the human brain likes the frameworks, they like the language. So how do we give, whether it's from the C-suite down to the factory floor, a language that allows them to talk to each other, whatever that language may be, whether it's around trust, whether it's around productivity, whatever it may be. So we have to, that's the third point, is we've got to have a common language across the whole organization. And the third point is we need to make sure there's reinforcement and accountability. What we don't want, I've got a colleague that always says something that I really like, which is when he speaks to someone who says, oh, I've done the 7 habits, he always asks just the once, because it's got to be a habit. And habit is, they only really become habits when we reinforce them. And in organizations, increasingly, there has to be a level of accountability around the behavior we expect people to have. And then lastly, the fifth point is typically we found journeys have to be blended. So there has to be an element of what are we going to do in terms of the people interaction, whether that's live online or whether it's in the room. What is the element that is supported through on demand? Typically, reinforcement works really nicely on demand. What we found is that saying to someone, go do some on demand learning works fairly well for compliance, but for behavior change, it works really best for reinforcement. So they've had an experience that gets them into the idea of learning, and then we reinforce that later on. And you may have that blend of articles, video content, podcasts, whatever it may be. So yeah, those really are the 5 things that we think about to move away from just a single point. It's intentional business case, leader-led with the champions in the team. Do we have a common language? Is it reinforced? Are people held to account? And is it a blended journey?
Well, what I really liked when you started that is you said with all of your when you're designing an intervention. So I'm trying to figure the right words. You don't like. I'm avoiding training. Intervention sounds very similar to training, but
Because training is like, why I don't like training is it feels like I'm going to go get fixed.
yeah.
Whereas there's learning, there's application. The way I would say is, how do we have a solution that drives people, a large group of people, to change their behavior? So I quite like the word solution.
So when you're developing solutions to support organizations through change, how important is storytelling?
Massively important, and it's a really, really fine line, I think, for me. And like, we can take that from the point of view of content design. So our content design happens primarily in the US and then is localized all around the world. So there's the idea of how important is storytelling in content design. There's also what happens in the room is really important when you're a consultant. How important is storytelling? And then also you've got the overall story for the solution. What we've found, if I take that third piece first, the overall storytelling for the solution. So we worked previously, we worked with a large construction organization and then also a very large tech firm that everybody would know and already use daily. And one of the things, again, same colleague that I had talked about before, that he really pushed the leader to do, particularly in that tech firm, was start telling the story immediately. And one of the things that he got him to do was, in a tech firm, having a handwritten invitation is really unusual. So he got this leader to write a handwritten invitation. So the storytelling was starting within the solution. And that's really important. How are we going to tell the story of why we're doing what we're doing? In the room, as a consultant, you're always storytelling. You're always trying to tell a story. But there's always this danger of becoming autobiographical, where it becomes about being the sage on the stage rather than being someone who your story unlocks other people's story. And that's what, in the room, the intention has to be, is how does my story help other people tell their stories? And then in content design, which I think is one of the most intentional ways we're thinking about using stories, is we're always thinking about what do we want people to do as a result of coming and learning with us. But doing doesn't exist in isolation. There's 2 things that tend to motivate whether we do something. Either we know something different or we feel something. So typically when we're thinking about stories, it's about how do we have a story that helps someone to feel an emotion that motivates them to then do something. So there's really famous stories that anyone who's been on the 7 Habits, you will remember the story Stephen tells about being on the train in early Sunday morning. There's these stories we tell. We tell stories about Andy Roddick playing against Fernando Dodasco at the Italian Open and making a call against himself and going on to lose the match, but that's about his integrity. So stories are about helping motivate behavior change. Typically, no one changes their behavior unless they hear a story. It's a story they tell themselves, or it's a story someone else has told them. But that will then motivate the change in behavior. So as an organization, we believe storytelling is critical, but has to be intentional.
And as storytelling is so critical, presumably it's not just the story, it's the telling of it. And how do you manage telling stories in a consistent way? Because your team are coming in to perhaps launch something, but real change takes a long time to embed and deliver. So how do you overcome that challenge?
The word you use, consistent, is one of the most important things, because if you think about our solutions, we design them and then they could potentially be deployed in 160 countries. And it might not just be us who does it. So our model is actually to enable clients to deliver themselves. So when I delivered 7 Habits, or when Lucy was working with you on Trust, that I was an employee of FranklinCovey. I was what was called a client facilitator. And so what we have is a real need for consistency, knowing we don't know who's going to be delivering it. We don't actually know what their level of capability is going to be around training, learning and development, whatever it may be. So consistency is really important. For that reason, we have a really, really firm video strategy. So what we know is we've got fantastic facilitators out there in our clients. We've also got people who've never facilitated before in their lives. And I've got a great story about someone who did that and did an amazing, amazing job. But what we know is that a video strategy has to enable that, because the video strategy enables the storytelling strategy. So we're always thinking, when we're designing a program, do we need to build out a story or a video that communicates knowledge? Increasingly, that's becoming a rarity. If you went back to some of our programs that were maybe designed 20 or 25 years ago, you would see a lot of videos about communicating knowledge, about kind of the videos were designed to teach, almost just in case the facilitator wasn't able to teach. Whereas now our approach to video content is primarily around, okay, we may need to communicate an idea, we may need to communicate knowledge, but how do we communicate a story? We also typically try to focus on real stories. So a real human being. We do occasionally have some acted videos, but again, they're falling out of favor. But for me, it's all about that intentionality. Is if we're going to be consistent, then we need to have a story that resonates globally. So we may have a story of, just a recent one in our update of 7 Habits, when we're talking about someone working within their circle of influence. We have a story that's pretty universal. It's about the US school system, but it's about an immigrant from Thailand coming in and teaching in the US school system. So it adds an element of, we can see ourselves in that story. And it's a really interesting one, or whether it's doctors, or whether it's the rescue of the boys from the Thai cave, which is another story we're talking about in terms of how people come together. It's always about motivating that feeling. And what we know is that feeling is going, if that's going to motivate the change, then that has to be consistent. We can't rely on how one person says a word and how one other person says a word. And we have tried that. We've got a couple of programs where we said, oh, we're not going to do any video content at all. And we'll just have people tell stories, and we'll give them stories to tell. Personally, it's my least favorite program to deliver, because it feels like you're telling other people's stories. And for me, I think we can have consistent use of video to tell other people's story. When I'm in the room, I'm going to tell my story in a way that helps other people to tell theirs.
What's you said maybe 20 years ago you may have used actors in videos to tell stories, for example, but now it's more, the shift has been towards real people. What's driven that change?
I think, from my view, like society in general, I think we're so used now to seeing, I don't know what the appropriate phrase for it is, but like user-generated content. We're so used to YouTube. That I love narrative, and I love fiction. I was a box set binger in the late 90s and early 2000s. But if you look at the quality of television production, if you look at TV now, it is so high quality that if you're using something with actors, you're now being compared against productions that have got millions and millions of pounds invested into it, and you need to have a match. Whereas if you're looking at something that's real, you've got Vox Pops on the news, you've got YouTube, you've got things where, hey, production can be pretty good, but the parity is a lot easier to match to. So for me, it's about familiarity and not being seen as like, oh, this is a budget version of that. Or, we've got people who have not got the best level of acting skill or something like that. I think for me, there's big drivers around just the quality of video that's out there right now, that if you're professionally producing it or professionally selling it, you've got to be on parity with it. And I think real stories are a lot easier to get to that parity.
And linked to that point, do you think there's a space where organizations can use their people to tell stories around change, for example, more effectively than than senior leaders perhaps standing up and
Yeah,
talking about change?
massively, massively. I think hearing a story from someone in the business is really impactful. I think there's some really I've got some views on this, if you'll let me. And so I think user generated content, I don't know, I'm trying to remember, it was probably about 10, 12 years ago. There were lots of learning platforms that started trying to be YouTube and trying to say, we're going to get everybody to do videos and we're going to get everybody to train each other and it'll be all user generated. I think that's a nice idea, but it misses a really fundamental truth. So if you look at the population of the world and look at the number of people who are actually recording videos on YouTube, it's a tiny, tiny population. Most people want to consume, not many people want to create. Those people that want to create, fantastic. So I think for me, looking for stories internally at organizations and expecting people to create them themselves, show me the successful ones of those and I'll show you the entire bucket of unsuccessful ones of those. Whereas actually, as I said before, a really intentional, actually that person's got a story to tell. Let's invest in their ability to tell that story. There's a client we worked with who we were working with their leadership team. We were doing a much more bigger rollout eventually, and they decided to record a video of people just sharing their experience on the program. And one of their managing directors, guy called Lee, on video, he shared about how the program had helped him be a better parent. And this was a guy who wasn't really going to talk most of the time, wouldn't have ever done an upload. But that story was so powerful for their rollout, for the whole program, for the company to have Lee tell that story. And the only way to get it out was to intentionally get it rather than say, oh, Lee, go record a video on your phone. Some people do that and they'll do an amazing job. I believe they're in the minority.
You mentioned before briefly about podcasts, and I think that alludes to the point of meeting people where they are.
Yeah.
So can you talk to me a bit about that and tools, I suppose, outside of traditional in-person events and video solutions that you use?
Yeah, so I think it's a really, really interesting challenge because meeting people where they're at it's different meeting the person where they're at and the person who is an employee or a leader of an organization. While we really advocate the whole person, that they need to see that the whole person, oftentimes people will go and seek out learning that they want for themselves in whatever way they want to do it. They might find an app that lets them there was a whole streaking craze of do things a couple of times, keep doing it. You don't want to break your streak, and you keep going, and that's a really useful tool. When it comes to organizational learning, I think meeting people where they're at is about understanding what's the learning culture in the organization. I.e., what are you actually going to push? How are you going to hold people accountable? What resources you can start giving to people? So I think for me, there's a cycle that has to start with people doing an element of self-reflection. If I want to go and find something out that's for me personally, I will tend to Google it, or I'll go on YouTube and see if there's a video around it. I'll maybe find an article for it. Information is pretty democratic. To motivate me to actually do something in an organizational context, there's got to be that level of reflection. So typically we would say some sort of assessment that says, how am I doing right now? And that assessment then can motivate someone to want to do something differently because either they're doing well, they're doing less well, they might be somewhere in the middle. That then gives people context for what they're being taught and what they want to learn. And then to your point around reinforcement and different ideas and application apps and habit builders and all those things, for me, they come in as the reinforcement and the sustainability of learning. It's, there's the famous forgetting curve where it says you go on a learning and development program and you've forgotten 80% of it within the first 24 hours. So my question is always, well, how are we going to help people choose what they want to remember? As an organization, we cannot tell them what they want to remember. They need to choose that. The things we remember typically are the things that we experience. So when you're having an experience, whether that's through watching a video, through having an experience in a room, through an app, there's something that's going to trigger the memory. If you put 100 people in the room that had all been on the 7 habits, they would all probably remember something a little bit differently from what they cared about in that. But what they're then choosing to do afterwards would be equally as different. Now, when I first went on the 7 habits, I became all about, again, in this context, streaking. It became all about,
Cut to Paul streaking.
Indeed.
On his phone.
Yeah, the jiggling would be hypnotic. So what we would have would get to the point where I'd say, look, I want to read more. So let's track how often I'm reading. And I think that's a really powerful thing to do. It works for me because I simply don't want to break the fact that I have read for a minimum of 10 minutes a day now for almost 2,000 days straight. I do not want to break that streak. I've adapted that streak where now audiobooks is okay, just because the amount of travel that you do and things like that. But that for me is a really important thing. There's other people that say, you know what, actually listening to a podcast is something that I really want to do. So we have a podcast just like you do that we can put people in the direction of. But it starts with the story that someone's going to tell them themselves that then motivates what they want to seek out, whether it's quitting smoking after the back of something, whether it's, you know what, I want to get better at managing my time, or I want to get better at listening to people. We're always forgetting. So what is it that you remember? One of the things that I truly believe absolutely motivates behavior change more than anything else is teaching. So I am always a better practitioner of the 7 habits after I have taught it. So you get this kind of tail off, and then I'll teach another session and we go back up. And my wife will always be able to know, because I'll come back in and I'll really truly be practicing empathic listening with her. And after a couple of days, she'll go, stop FranklinCoveying me. But the idea of teaching to learn, that is where the personal storytelling within organization comes in. Actually, if you can have someone who's been on an experience and then is teaching other people about that experience. One of the most amazing experiences I've ever had at FranklinCovey is working with a construction organization and a guy called Martin, who was their chief operating officer. Martin was not a trainer. He was not a facilitator. He was a guy that grew up on the tools. But we've been working with him and rolling out learning, and he wanted to facilitate it. And watching Martin in a unfiltered, maybe messy way of facilitation. He was by no means perfect, but he was perfect because he was a brickie telling other brickies, you could do something differently. And Martin was not the biggest advocate at the beginning of the program. So to see him standing up and advocating it, but he'd been on his journey and now he's telling his story to other people. That's the key thing. I just don't believe you can expect everyone to tell their stories without some element of intervention from the organization to say, let's draw those stories out.
Yeah, absolutely.
They don't just happen.
I think I know how you're gonna answer this next question. So we're coming to the end. To be honest, I haven't really used my questions. You've been amazing. But what is one principle, or the most important principle, or one of the most important principles, in creating a great growth and learning culture in an organization?
That's a very, very big question. I think it ultimately depends on the organization, but I would say the thing that I have seen derail growth and organizational cultures when it comes to learning more often than not has been leadership alignment.
Okay.
I have probably lost count the number of times I've been in a room and someone says to me, and my team would agree with this as well, when someone says to me, this is all very well, I'll do it when my boss does. And it's, for me, culture is the norms, it's the collective language, it's just the way we do things around here. But the fundamental truth of culture is this: people will do it when they see it being done. Visibility is really, really, really important. So for me, one of the things I love to push clients on, particularly I'm talking to a chief exec, is say learning can't just be for them out there, it needs to be for you. And what I am really gratified by is that there's many more senior leadership teams who are saying, yes, learning does need to be up for us as well. So I think for me, it's about actually learning can't be for them. Learning needs to be for everyone in the organization. And that's how you're truly going to get cultural change. It's how you get that connection in language. It's how you get people to actually shift, because they've not got an excuse. The moment a leader doesn't practice what other people have been taught, they have an excuse not to do it themselves. But if you see a leader trying, knowing they've been on a program, knowing they've done some learning, and they're trying, and maybe they're messing up a little bit, they're trying. And that almost creates a moral imperative for everyone else to try. It really genuinely does sit with asking leaders and CEOs, are you actually up for this? And if you're not, why bother?
And it breaks the barrier down between an ivory tower and the rest of the organization, right? And showing that leaders, CEOs are humans too, and they can make mistakes and be vulnerable.
There's an energy company we're working with who the leadership team decided they wanted an overview of the content. And I said, sure, but I'm not going to do an overview. We're actually going to do some learning. And there was one piece of content around questioning that I shared, and the COO, who was going to be the future CEO and now is, he said, I've got to go to a meeting. And he came back in 15 minutes later and said, Paul, I just tried what you said. In that meeting, I only asked questions. I didn't make any statements. Best meeting I've ever had. And then he was talking to people who were going at lower levels, going through the cohort, and able to share that learning experience to them. It enhanced his credibility. It enhanced their belief. It was just really cool watching him share. Yeah, I tried that. It was amazing.
Fantastic. That's it. It's been really, really interesting listening to you and talking to you, Paul. I actually do hope we can do a part 2 again.
I would love to do a part 2.
It's probably a part 2 and a part 3 in there. But one final question I've got for you that I'm asking everybody.
Yeah.
What do you love most about your role and the world you work in, and what do you find the most challenging?
Really great question. It's a challenging thing because not many times do you find a total and complete alignment between who you are and the organization you work with. So the fact that I get to work, and I do believe this, that I get to work with FranklinCovey, and that I then get to work with our amazing consultant team. And it is a genuine privilege. So there's not many things. I love our content. That is probably the thing that I love the most. In fact, I get to work with our content and talk to other people about the amazing content that we have. The fact that I get to fanboy when Stephen M.R. Covey talks, or, one of our other thought leaders like Corey Kogan, or just all these people who are, when I was a client, it was like, oh, I saw you on video, but now they're a colleague. That's super, super cool. The single most challenging thing for me, if I look in the lens of the 7 habits, and I'm not going to say all the 7 habits because people can go look for those, but the third habit is, a lot of people think it's the habit of time management, but it's put first things first. It's about prioritization. My single biggest challenge is I want to say yes to every single thing because I believe I can add value. So being able to say no to something where I know I could add value, but there's a bigger yes over here, that's a perennial struggle for me, and it goes back and forth all the time. And I think it probably will always be that.
Yeah. Okay, I can definitely relate to that. But yeah, your passion and love for FranklinCovey and the products.
I'm a total nerd, but I also get to work for it. So.
Yeah, it really comes through, and it's come through the whole time I've known you as well, and it is a great course. 7 Habits is brilliant. There's another plug there for it. Thank you, Paul. It's been fantastic talking to you, and yeah, we'll speak again soon.
We definitely will. Cheers.
You can find more episodes of Real Impacts on your favourite platform. Follow us on socials and check out our website for more.